Capture of a Clever Swindler by Thomas Furlong. Coffee Break Collection 21. Fairy Tales, Tall Stories, and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Capture of a Clever Swindler. Sam Bernard's unique method of defrauding the railroads. How he did the work. His conviction after a long chase. Between the years of 1870 and 1876, the railroads of this country had been swindled time after time by some unknown person changing the address on an invoice of goods after it had reached the railroad office. This was done on an order which purported to come from the firm which had shipped the goods. In February of 1876, a shipment of gentlemen's dress goods was sent to A. Alden and Company of Franklin, Pennsylvania, by Brock and Weiner of Buffalo. The consignment was valued at $721.19. A few minutes after the goods had been delivered at the freight office, a man entered and told the agent that the boxes had been marked with the name of the wrong town, that they should go to Corry, Pennsylvania, instead of Franklin. The agent demanded an order from the firm before making the change. The pretended clerk wrote out the order, signing the firm name to it, and the address, Corry, was substituted for that of Franklin. This being done, the supposed clerk went to Corry. Here he pretended that he was a merchant from New York, and that he was to open an auction store in the town. The merchant tailors did not like to have their trade injured in this manner, so they offered to buy the goods. The pretended merchant sold them at a much reduced price, and received a check for $359.60. He endorsed the check with A. Alden's name, thus adding forgery to his other crimes. Then the case was given to me. 2 weeks went by without a clue to the swindler. I found that other detectives had been hunting for a man who had played the same game in other cities, but the culprit had guarded himself so well that even his real name was unknown. From the descriptions obtained and from his general manner of operation, it was known that the same person had been operating on all the roads where this swindling had occurred. One day while in Buffalo, I chanced to go into a cigar store. At this time, the newspapers were full of the swindle, and some of the people in the store were discussing the affair. An old gentleman who was among those present said that a young man who had been employed in the same store with himself about 6 years previously had swindled his employers in the same manner. This was in Rochester. I took the hint, and after questioning the old man, I found that the name of his former working companion was William Bernard. I went to Rochester, and while there, obtained the names of some of his acquaintances, and finally found a photograph of him. The description given to me by the detectives tallied with the photograph of Bernard. I therefore made up my mind that Bernard was the man that I wanted. After further inquiry, I found that relations of Bernard lived in Detroit, Michigan. I went there and obtained information as to the whereabouts of the swindler. I followed him through Montreal, Canada, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Toledo, Chicago, to St. Louis. He was known in all these places as Jew Harry. It seemed that it was impossible to find a detective in any one place who had not, at some time or other, been on Bernard's tracks. On my arrival in St. Louis, June 26, 1876, I went to the office of Chief of Police McDonough at once. I told him who I was, and that I had information which led me to believe that Bernard had worked in St. Louis. When the chief, who was very portly and somewhat gruff, heard this, he straightened up in his chair and said, "That's impossible. That fellow would not dare to come to St. Louis. He would be afraid. He knows he could not work any such game in this town. My police would be sure to get him." I then told the chief that I had reason to believe that Bernard had been in St. Louis within the last few days. This idea the chief fairly ridiculed. Just at this moment, a rather elderly man entered the office in a very excited manner. He had brown hair, streaked with gray, and wore short sideburns, or Galways, as they are sometimes called. He asked if he could see the chief for a few minutes, so I at once rose to leave the office. The chief told me to remain, then asked the visitor to state his business. He told the chief that his name was H. M. Smith, and that he was a pawnbroker in business at 8th and Morgan Streets. He then went on to say that a man giving the name of Solomon, representing that he was from Cleveland, Ohio, had called on him a few days previous. He had represented himself as a pawnbroker, and had presented the business card of Solomon and Company of Cleveland. Mr. Smith told him that he knew of the firm, but never had the pleasure of meeting a member of it. Solomon then told Smith that he had a nephew who had been in business with him for years, but that he had gone out west in the mining district of Colorado and opened up a pawnshop of his own. There was then a large demand for revolvers and pistols of heavy caliber, and that he had ordered about $2,000 worth of heavy caliber guns and ammunition from the Simmons Hardware Company of St. Louis. After he had placed the order with the request that it be packed and shipped immediately, he had received a telegram from his nephew, stating that he had gotten into trouble and had been forced to leave the country, and therefore could not take the order from Simmons. He requested Solomon to call at Simmons and cancel the order. The Simmons people informed Solomon that as the firearms were already packed and in the freight house, preparatory for shipping, they could not cancel the order. Solomon then said to Smith, "I have no use for these pistols and guns, and I can't ship them to my nephew in Colorado, since he has left there. I will have these goods brought up to your store, and you can examine them. Then, if you find them just as I have represented, I will let you have them at your own price. You can easily sell them and make some money on them." Mr. Smith assented. Solomon then went and got a drayman and had the firearms brought to Smith's office from the freight depot. Solomon got there about the time the goods did and had the cases opened. Smith found the goods were just as Solomon represented, so he told Solomon that he would give him $1,100 for them, which was about half their value. Solomon, with tears in his eyes, accepted Smith's check for that amount and left for parts unknown. On the morning of my arrival, and while I was talking to Chief McDonough, Smith had received by mail a bill for the goods from Simmons Hardware Company, which extended to him the privilege of discounting the bill, and that upon making immediate payment he might deduct the usual %. Whereupon Mr. Smith called upon the Simmons Hardware Company, and was there informed that a man resembling him very much had called there and selected a bill of goods, and had also presented Smith's business card. They thought it was Mr. Smith, and upon finding him all right formerly, had unhesitatingly packed and shipped the goods as directed. Smith and Bernard looked very much alike, wearing the same style of beard and having about the same complexion. Smith's description of Solomon, who was really Bernard, was very accurate, and finally wound up by saying that Solomon looked enough like him to be his younger brother. While Smith was telling the chief this story, I was listening, and when he began to describe Solomon, I asked the chief if I might be permitted to ask Mr. Smith a few questions. "Why, certainly," replied the chief. "Do you think," I then said to Smith, "that you would know this man Solomon if you should see him again?" "Surely," answered Mr. Smith, "I would know him anywhere." I then took Bernard's picture from my pocket and asked Smith if that resembled Solomon. He threw up his hands and exclaimed, "Why, that is him! That's an excellent picture of him." I then turned to the chief and said, "Chief, it seems that Bernard was not afraid to come to St. Louis after all." I then got busy and learned that Bernard had left St. Louis over the Burlington and had gone to Quincy, Illinois, a few days before my arrival. I then took the first train for Quincy. There I learned of a similar swindle with a case of goods shipped to Edina, Missouri. I left at once for Edina. There the freight agent informed me that a man named Solomon, and answering to the description of Bernard, had called for a case of goods, but the agent, who was a relative of the party to whom the goods had been originally consigned, had refused to deliver them until presented with some identification. Just about this time I received word that Solomon was walking out of town. I pursued him, arrested him, and brought him back to town. At first he denied everything, even his photograph, but finally consented to go with me when I brought out other proofs. I at once applied for a requisition from the authorities. After the capture of Bernard at Edina by me, Bernard's lawyer insisted that he could not be taken to Pennsylvania while he stood charged with a felony in Missouri. Therefore, when he made his plea, I telegraphed a friend in St. Louis to employ a good criminal lawyer and have him report to me at Edina. My friend employed Colonel Nat C. Claiborne of St. Louis. At the same time, I wired Mr. Smith to come up at once, or sent his son Sam to Edina for the purpose of identifying Solomon. In due time, both Sam Smith and Colonel Claiborne arrived in Edina. Colonel Claiborne was an old citizen and was well known all over the state. He was acquainted with the judge of Knox County and had him convene a special term of court and impanel a special grand jury. I arranged to have witnesses appear before the grand jury, which immediately indicted Bernard for the Edina swindle, Colonel Claiborne assisting the prosecuting attorney at Edina for the state. Bernard was convicted and sent to the penitentiary at Jefferson City, Missouri, for 4 years. I accompanied him to Jefferson City, where I procured a duplicate of the receipt for the body of Bernard from the warden of the Missouri Penitentiary, and previously a certified copy of the proceedings at the trial and conviction in Knox County, which I turned over to the officers of the Allegheny Valley Railroad on my return to Pittsburgh. This satisfied them, but not so well as if I had extradited Bernard and brought him back to Pennsylvania for trial. I omitted to say that on the night that Sam Smith arrived in Edina from St. Louis, that the small hotel was filled to overflowing, and the landlord was obliged to assign Smith to my room, which was in the front of the second story, just over the office. About 10 o'clock that night, just as Smith and I had retired to our room, preparatory to turning in for the night, a shower of missiles such as rocks, stones, and pistol shots were fired through the window of our room from the opposite side of the street. Upon investigation, I found that Bernard had enlisted the cooperation of some sympathizers, through a lawyer in the town whom he had employed to defend him, and at the instance of whom this mob was formed with a view to frightening Smith and myself and the other witnesses who were to appear in the case out of town. We were so badly frightened that we did not leave town until Bernard had been tried and convicted, and when we left, Bernard left with us. End of Capture of a Clever Swindler. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Hans Andersen's Fairy Tales, Second Series, by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, situated in the northeast of the island of Ireland. Hans Andersen's Fairy Tales, Second Series, by Hans Christian Andersen. Chapter 2. The Daisy. Now listen, out in the country, close by the roadside, stood a pleasant house. You have seen one like it, no doubt, very often. In front lay a little fenced-in garden, full of blooming flowers. Near the hedge, in the soft green grass, grew a little daisy. The sun shone as brightly and warmly upon her as upon the large and beautiful garden flowers, so the daisy grew from hour to hour. Every morning she unfolded her little white petals, like shining rays, round the little golden sun in the centre of the flower. She never seemed to think that she was unseen down in the grass, or that she was only a poor insignificant flower. She felt too happy to care for that. Merrily she turned toward the warm sun, looked up to the blue sky, and listened to the lark singing high in the air. One day the little flower was as joyful as if it had been a great holiday, although it was only Monday. All the children were at school, and while they sat on their benches learning their lessons, she on her little stem leaned also from the warm sun and from everything around her how good God is, and it made her happy to hear the lark expressing in his song her own glad feelings. The daisy admired the happy bird who could warble so sweetly and fly so high, and she was not at all sorrowful because she could not do the same. I can see and hear, thought she, the sun shines upon me, and the wind kisses me. What else do I need to make me happy? Within the garden grew a number of aristocratic flowers. The less scent they had, the more they flaunted. The peonies considered it a grand thing to be so large, and puffed themselves out to be larger than the roses. The tulips knew that they were marked with beautiful colours, and held themselves bolt upright, so that they might be seen more plainly. They did not notice the little daisy outside, but she looked at them and thought how rich and beautiful they are. No wonder the pretty bird flies down to visit them. How glad I am that I grow so near them, that I may admire their beauty. Just at this moment the lark flew down crying "Tweet!" but he did not go to the tall peonies and tulips. He hopped into the grass near the lowly daisy. She trembled for joy and hardly knew what to think. The little bird hopped round the daisy singing, "Oh, what a sweet soft grass, and what a lovely little flower, with gold in its heart and silver on its dress." For the yellow centre in the daisy looked like gold, and the leaves around were glittering white like silver. How happy the little daisy felt, no one can describe. The bird kissed her with his peck, sang to her, and then flew up again into the blue air above. It was at least a quarter of an hour before the daisy could recover herself. Half ashamed, yet happy in herself, she glanced at the other flowers. They must have seen the honour she had received, and would understand her delight and pleasure. But the tulips looked prouder than ever. Indeed, they were evidently quite vexed about it. The peonies were disgusted, and could they have spoken, poor little Daisy would no doubt have received a good scolding. She could see they were all out of temper, and it made her very sorry. At this moment there came into the garden a little girl with a large glittering knife in her hand. She went straight to the tulips and cut off several of them. "Oh dear," sighed the daisy, "how shocking! It is all over with them now." The girl carried the tulips away, and the daisy felt very glad to grow outside in the grass and to be only a poor little flower. When the sun set she folded up her leaves and went to sleep. She dreamed the whole night long of the warm sun and the pretty little bird. The next morning, when she joyfully stretched out her white leaves once more to the warm air and the light, she recognized the voice of the bird, but his song sounded mournful and sad. Alas, he had good reason to be sad. He had been caught and made a prisoner in a cage that hung close by the open window. He sang of the happy time when he could fly in the air joyous and free, of the young green corn in the fields, from which he would spring higher and higher to sing his glorious song. But now he was a prisoner in a cage. The little daisy wished very much to help him, but what could she do? In her anxiety she forgot all the beautiful things around her, the warm sunshine, and her own pretty shining white leaves. Alas, she could think of nothing but the captive bird and her own inability to help him. Two boys came out of the garden. One of them carried a sharp knife in his hand, like the one with which the girl had cut the tulips. They went straight to the little daisy, who could not think what they were going to do. "We can cut out a nice piece of turf for the lark here," said one of the boys, and he began to cut a square piece round the daisy, so that she stood just in the centre. "Pull up the flower," said the other boy, and the daisy trembled with fear, for to pluck her up would destroy her life, and she wished so much to live and to be taken to the captive lark in his cage. "No, let it stay where it is," said the boy, "it looks so pretty." So the daisy remained, and was put with the turf in the lark's cage. The poor bird was complaining loudly about his lost freedom, beating his wings against the iron bars of his prison. The little daisy could make no sign and utter no word to console him, as she would gladly have done. The whole morning passed in this manner. "There was no water here," said the captive lark. "They have all gone out and have forgotten to give me a drop to drink. My throat is hot and dry. I feel as if I had fire and ice within me, and the air is so heavy. Alas, I must die. I must bid farewell to the warm sunshine, the fresh green, and the beautiful things which God has created." And then he thrust his beak into the cool turf to refresh himself a little with the green grass, and as he did so his eye fell upon the daisy. The bird nodded to her and kissed her with his beak and said, "You also will wither here, you poor little flower. They have given you to me with the little patch of green grass on which you grew, in exchange for the whole world which was mine out there. Each little blade of grass is to me as a great tree, and each of your white leaves is a flower. Alas, you only show me how much I have lost." "Oh, if I could only comfort him," thought the daisy, but she could not move a leaf. The perfume from her leaves was stronger than is usual in these flowers, and the bird noticed it, and though he was fainting with thirst, and in his pain pulled up the green blades of grass, he did not touch the flower. The evening came, and yet no one had come to bring the bird a drop of water. Then he stretched out his pretty wings and shook convulsively. He could only sing "Tweet, tweet" in a weak, mournful tone. His little head bent down toward the flower. The bird's heart was broken with want and pining. Then the flower could not fold her leaves as she had done the evening before when she went to sleep, but, sick and sorrowful, drooped toward the earth. Not till morning did the boys come, and when they found the bird dead, they wept many and bitter tears. They dug a pretty grave for him and adorned it with leaves of flowers. The bird's lifeless body was placed in a smart bread box, and was buried with great honour. Poor bird! While he was alive and could sing, they forgot him, and allowed him to sit in his cage and suffer want. But now that he was dead, they mourned for him with many tears and buried him in royal state. But the turf of the daisy on it was thrown out into the dusty road. No one thought of the little flower that had felt more for the poor bird than had any one else, and that would have been so glad to help and comfort him if she had been able. End of Chapter 2, The Daisy, by Hans Christian Andersen. This recording is in the public domain.
Dear Old Grandmother by Lucy A. Yendes. Coffee Break Collection 21. Fairy Tales, Tall Stories and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, situated in the northeast of the island of Ireland. Dear Old Grandmother. Grandmother paces with stately tread forward and back through the quaint old room, out of the firelight dancing and red, into the gathering dusk and gloom. Forward and back in her silken dress, with its falling ruffles of frost-like lace, a look of the deepest tenderness in the faded lines of her fine old face. Warm on her breast, in his red nightgown, like a scarlet lily the baby lies, while softly the weary lids creep down over the little sleepy eyes. Grandmother sings to him sweet and low, and memories come with the cradle song of the day when she sang it long ago, when her life was young and her heart was strong. Grandmother's children have left her now. The large old house is a shadowed place, but the shining out in the sunset glow of her life like a star comes the baby's face. Here lies where of old his father lay, and softly she sings him the same sweet strain, till the years intervening are swept away, and the joys of life's morning are hers again. Grandmother's head is bending low over the dear little drowsy one. The steps of her pathway are few to go, the baby's journey has just begun, yet the rosy dawn of his childish love brightens the evening that else were dim, and in after years, from her home above, the light of her blessing will rest on him. End of Dear Old Grandmother by Lucy A. Yendes. The Fair Princess by Alfred M. Williams. Coffee Break Collection 21. Fairy Tales, Tall Stories and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, situated in the northeast of the island of Ireland. The Fair Princess. The princess sat in her garden fair. With a golden comb she combed her hair. She raised her eyes to the azure bay. A brave fleet bore in with pennons gay. Good captains say in the Holy Land, have you seen my spouse with his brave band? In Holy Land is many a knight. With what point device was he bedight? His steed bore saddle of silver gilt. The cross of Christ was his gold sword hilt. A knight with these I saw bravely fall in fierce assault on a city's wall. A wretched widow I have become, to mourn and weep in a ruined home. I have 3 daughters, lovely and sage, but spouseless and weak in orphanage. What gift to him who returns your spouse? All the gold and silver in the house? Of gold and silver I have no need. Some other guerdon must be my meed. I have 3 great mills, all shall be thine. They grind white wheat and benzoin fine. The delicate flour so finely wrought, the royal stewards have always sought. For your 3 mills I have no desire. Some other reward must pay my hire. My roof tile of gold and ivory, your gold and ivory tiles are not for me. My daughters fair, you shall have them all, 2 to serve you in your banquet hall. The 3rd and fairest shall be your bride, in love's nest to slumber by your side. Princess, your fair daughters count for naught. A costlier gift is in my thought. I have nothing more to offer thee. No other gift can you ask of me. But I only ask, and you can spare, the simple gift of your body fair. A fouler insult knight ne'er gave. Haste, vassals, and scourge this loathly knave. The wedding ring with diamonds bright we broke in twain on our bridal night. Where is the half you have kept so dear? The other half you can see it here. How many tears you have made me shed! How slow the lingering years have fled! What pains and griefs lie in your debt, when bliss like this cannot forget. End of The Fair Princess by Alfred M. Williams.
Fraudulent Cosmetics and Anti-Aging Products by the FBI. Coffee Break Collection 21. Fairy Tales, Tall Stories, and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fraudulent Cosmetics and Anti-Aging Products by the FBI. The volume of counterfeit cosmetics arriving in the U.S. is on the rise. The Internet has given consumers widespread access to health and beauty products, some labeled with anti-aging properties that they don't know are fake. Counterfeiters of personal care products increasingly view dealing in these fake items as a low-risk crime since many of them are located outside the U.S. Government and industry studies and testing have discovered dangerous ingredients within counterfeit anti-aging products. Fraudulent cosmetics may contain arsenic, beryllium, and cadmium, all known carcinogens, along with high levels of aluminum and dangerous levels of bacteria from sources such as urine. Some of these products have caused conditions like acne, psoriasis, rashes, and eye infections. Tips for avoiding fraudulent anti-aging products. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Watch out for special formulas or breakthroughs. Don't be afraid to ask questions about the product. Find out exactly what it should and should not do for you. Research a product thoroughly before buying it. Call the Better Business Bureau to find out if other people have complained about the product. Be wary of products that claim to cure a wide variety of illnesses, particularly serious ones that don't appear to be related. Be aware that testimonials and/or celebrity endorsements are often misleading. Be very careful of products that are marketed as having no side effects. Question products that are advertised as making visits to a physician unnecessary. Always consult your doctor before taking any dietary or nutritional supplement. End of Fraudulent Cosmetics and Anti-Aging Products by the FBI.
The Gardener by Robert Louis Stevenson. Coffee Break Collection 21. Fairy Tales, Tall Stories and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland. Situated in the northeast of the island of Ireland. The Gardener. The gardener does not love to talk. He makes and keeps the gravel walk. And when he puts his tools away, he locks the door and takes the key. Away behind the currant row, where no one else but cook may go. Far in the plots I see him dig, old and serious, brown and big. He digs the flowers green, red and blue, nor wishes to be spoken to. He digs the flowers and cuts the hay, and never seems to want to play. Silly gardener, summer goes, and winter comes with pinching toes. When in the garden bare and brown, you must lay your barrow down. Well now, and while the summer stays, to profit by these garden days, oh how much wiser you would be to play at Indian wars with me. End of The Gardener by Robert Louis Stevenson. A Good Boy by Robert Louis Stevenson. Coffee Break Collection 21. Fairy Tales, Tall Stories and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner. I woke before the morning. I was happy all the day. I never said an ugly word, but smiled and stuck to play. And now at last the sun is going down behind the wood. And I am very happy, for I know that I've been good. My bed is waiting cool and fresh, with linen smooth and fair, and I must off to sleep sin by, and not forget my prayer. I know that till tomorrow I shall see the sun arise. No ugly dream shall fright my mind, no ugly sight my eyes. But slumber hold me tightly till I waken in the dawn, and hear the thrushes singing in the lilacs round the lawn. End of A Good Boy by Robert Louis Stevenson.
Chapter 1 of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Coffee Break Collection 21, Fairy Tales, Tall Stories, and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in July 2019. Huckleberry Finn, Chapter 1. You don't know about me without you have read the book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. But that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. That's nothing. I ain't never seen anybody but lied one time or another, without it was Aunt Polly or the widder, or maybe Mary. Ain't Polly, Tom's Aunt Polly, she is, and Mary, and the widder Douglas, is all told about in that book, which is mostly a true book, with some stretchers, as I said before. Now, the way that book winds up is this. Tom and me found the money that the robbers hid in the cave, and it made us rich. We got $6,000 apiece, all gold. It was an awful sight of money when it was piled up. Well, Judge Thatcher, he took it and put it out at interest, and it fetched us $1 a day apiece, all the year round, more than a body could tell what to do with. The widder Douglas, she took me for her son, and allowed she would civilize me, but it was rough living in the house all the time, considering how dismal, regular, and decent the widder was in all her ways. And so, when I couldn't stand it no longer, I lit out. I got into my old rags and my sugar hogshead again, and was free and satisfied. But Tom Sawyer, he hunted me up, and said he was going to start a band of robbers, and I might join him if I'd go back to the widder and be respectable. So I went back. The widder, she cried over me and called me a poor lost lamb, and she called me a lot of other names too, but she never meant no harm by it. She put me in them new clothes again, and I couldn't do nothing but sweat and feel all cramped up. Well, then the old thing commenced again. The widder rung the bell for supper, and you had to come to time. When you got to the table, you couldn't go right to eatin', but you had to wait for the widder to tuck down her head and grumble a little over the victuals, though there weren't really anything the matter with 'em. That is, nothing, only everything was cooked by itself. In a barrel of odds and ends, it's different. Things get mixed up, and the juice kind of swaps around, and things go better. After supper, she got out her book and learned me about Moses and the bulrushers, and I was in a sweat to find out all about him. But by and by she let it out that Moses had been dead a considerable long time. So then I didn't care no more about him, because I don't take no stock in dead people. Pretty soon I wanted to smoke, and asked the widow to let me, but she wouldn't. She said it was a mean practice and wasn't clean, and I must try not to do it any more. That is just the way with some people. They get down on a thing when they don't know nothing about it. Here she was bothering about Moses, which was no kin to her, and no use to anybody, being gone, you see, yet finding a power of fault with me for doing a thing that had some good in it. And she took snuff, too. Of course, that was all right, 'cause she done it herself. Her sister, Miss Watson, a tolerable slim old maid with goggles on, had just come to live with her, and took a set at me now with a spelling book. She worked me middlin' hard for about an hour, and then the widder made her ease up. I couldn't stood it much longer. Then for an hour it was deadly dull, and I was fidgety. Miss Watson would say, "Don't put your feet up there, Huckleberry."
and
"Don't scrunch up like that, Huckleberry. Set up straight."
And pretty soon she would say,
"Don't gap and stretch like that, Huckleberry. Why don't you try to behave?"
Then she told me all about the bad place, and I said I wished I was there.
She got mad then, but I didn't mean no harm. All I wanted was to go somewheres. All I wanted was a change. I weren't particular. She said it was wicked to say what I said she wouldn't say it for the whole world. She was going to live so as to go to the good place. Well, I couldn't see no advantage in going where she was going, so I made up my mind I wouldn't try for it. But I never said so, because it would only make trouble and wouldn't do no good. Now she had got a start, and she went on and told me all about the good place. She said all a body would have to do there was go around all day long with a harp and sing for ever and ever. So I didn't think much of it, but I never said so. I asked her if she reckoned Tom Sawyer would go there, and she said not by a considerable sight. I was glad about that, because I wanted him and me to be together. Miss Watson, she kept pecking at me, and it got tiresome and lonesome. By and by they fetched the niggers in and had prayers, and then everybody was off to bed. I went up to my room with a piece of candle and put it on the table. Then I set down in a chair by the window and tried to think of something cheerful, but it weren't no use. I felt so lonesome I most wished I was dead. The stars were shining, and the leaves rustled in the woods ever so mournful, and I heard an owl away off, hoo-hooing about somebody that was dead, and a whippoorwill, and a dog crying about somebody that was going to die, and the wind was trying to whisper something to me, and I couldn't make out what it was, and so it made the cold shivers run over me. Then away out in the woods I heard that kind of sound that a ghost makes when it wants to tell about something that's on its mind and can't make itself understood, and so can't rest easy in its grave, and has to go about that way every night grieving. I got so downhearted and scared I did wish I had some company. Pretty soon a spider went crawling up my shoulder, and I flipped it off, and it lit in the candle, and before I could budge it was all shriveled up. I didn't need anybody to tell me that that was an awful bad sign and would fetch me some bad luck, so I was scared and most shook the clothes off of me. I got up and turned around in my tracks 3 times and crossed my breast every time, and then I tied up a little lock of my hair with thread to keep witches away. But I hadn't no confidence. You do that when you've lost a horseshoe that you found, instead of nailing it up over the door, but I hadn't never heard anybody say it was any way to keep off bad luck when you killed a spider. I sat down again, a-shaking all over, and got out my pipe for a smoke, for the house was all as still as death now, and so the widow wouldn't know. Well, after a long time I heard the clock away off in the town go boom, 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 12 licks, and all still again, stiller than ever. Pretty soon I heard a twig snap down in the dark amongst the trees. Something was a-stirring. I sat still and listened. Directly I could just barely hear a meow, meow down there. That was good. Says I, meow, meow, as soft as I could, and then I put out the light and scrambled out the window onto the shed. Then I slipped down to the ground and crawled in among the trees, and sure enough, there was Tom Sawyer waiting for me. End of Chapter 1 of Huckleberry Finn.
Identity Theft by the FBI. Coffee Break Collection 21. Fairy Tales, Tall Stories, and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Identity Theft by the FBI. Identity theft occurs when someone assumes your identity to perform a fraud or other criminal act. Criminals can get the information they need to assume your identity from a variety of sources, including by stealing your wallet, rifling through your trash, or by compromising your credit or bank information. They may approach you in person, by telephone, or on the internet and ask you for the information. The sources of information about you are so numerous that you cannot prevent the theft of your identity. but you can minimize your risk of loss by following a few simple hints. Tips for avoiding identity theft. Never throw away ATM receipts, credit statements, credit cards, or banking statements in a usable form. Never give your credit card number over the telephone unless you make the call. Reconcile your bank account monthly and notify your bank of discrepancies immediately. Keep a list of telephone numbers to call to report the loss or theft of your wallet, credit cards, etc. Report unauthorized financial transactions to your bank, credit card company, and the police as soon as you detect them. Review a copy of your credit card report at least once each year. Notify the credit bureau in writing of any questionable entries and follow through until they are explained or removed. If your identity has been assumed, ask the credit card bureau to print a statement to that effect in your credit report. If you know of anyone who receives mail from credit card companies or banks in the names of others, report it to local or federal law enforcement authorities. End of Identity Theft by the FBI.
The Startling Adventures of Baron Munchausen, An Adventure with a Lion and a Crocodile by R.E. Raspe. Coffee Break Collection 21, Fairy Tales, Tall Stories, and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. The Startling Adventures of Baron Munchausen, An Adventure with a Lion and a Crocodile. Some years before my beard announced approaching manhood, or, in other words, when I was neither man nor boy, but between both, I expressed in repeated conversations a strong desire of seeing the world, from which I was discouraged by my parents, though my father had been no inconsiderable traveler himself. A cousin by my mother's side took a liking to me, often said I was a fine forward youth, and was much inclined to gratify my curiosity. His eloquence had more effect than mine, for my father consented to my accompanying him on a voyage to the island of Ceylon, where his uncle had resided as governor many years. We sailed from Amsterdam with dispatches from their high mightinesses, the States of Holland, and in about 6 weeks we arrived at Ceylon, where we were received with great marks of friendship and true politeness. After we had resided at Ceylon about a fortnight, I accompanied one of the governor's brothers upon a shooting party. Near the banks of a large piece of water which had engaged my attention, I thought I heard a rustling noise behind. On turning about, I was almost petrified, as who would not be, at the sight of a lion, which was evidently approaching with the intention of satisfying his appetite with my poor carcass, and that without asking my consent. What was to be done in this horrible dilemma? I had not even a moment for reflection. My piece was only charged with swan shot, and I had no other about me. However, though I could have no idea of killing such an animal with that weak kind of ammunition, yet I had some hopes of frightening him by the report, and perhaps of wounding him also. I immediately let fly, without waiting till he was within reach, and the report did but enrage him, for he now quickened his pace, and seemed to approach me full speed. I attempted to escape, but that only added, if an addition could be made, to my distress, for the moment I turned about I found a large crocodile with his mouth extended, almost ready to receive me. On my right hand was the piece of water before mentioned, and on my left a deep precipice. said to have, as I have since learned, a receptacle at the bottom for venomous creatures. In short, I gave myself up as lost, for the lion was now upon his hind legs, just in the act of seizing me. I fell involuntarily to the ground with fear, and, as it afterward appeared, he sprang over me. I lay some time in a situation which no language can describe, expecting to feel his teeth or talons in some part of me every moment. After waiting in this prostrate situation a few seconds, I heard a violent but unusual noise, differing from any sound that had ever before assailed my ears. Nor is it at all to be wondered at when I inform you from whence it proceeded. After listening for some time, I ventured to raise my head and look around, when, to my unspeakable joy, I perceived the lion had, by the eagerness with which he sprang at me, jumped forward as I fell into the crocodile's mouth, which, as before observed, was wide open. The head of the one stuck in the throat of the other, and they were struggling to extricate themselves. I, fortunately, recollected my hunting knife, which was by my side. With this instrument I severed the lion's head at one blow, and the body fell at my feet. I then, with the butt end of my fowling piece, rammed the head further into the throat of the crocodile, and destroyed him by suffocation, for he could neither gorge nor eject it. Soon after I had thus gained a complete victory over my two powerful adversaries, my companion arrived in search of me, for finding I did not follow him into the wood, he returned, apprehending I had lost my way or met with some accident. After mutual congratulations, we measured the crocodile, which was just 40 feet in length. End of The Startling Adventures of Baron Munchausen, an adventure with a lion and a crocodile.
The Matrimonial Swindle, song by Mr. W. Randall, written by W. H. Cove. Coffee Break Collection 21, Fairy Tales, Tall Stories, and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Matrimonial Swindle. I've been dreadfully treated, most shamefully cheated, by one whom I thought would be mine for life. Lend your auriculars, hear the particulars, how I was swindled of money, and my wife. You must know I was single when thinking I'd mingle mine own life with that of some pretty young miss. I'd just got £1,000, and a nice house and grounds, all to conduce to connubial bliss. I pondered without delay just to find out a way how I could just get a wife to my mind, when I fell quite promiscuous across a conspicuous advertisement of a peculiar kind. Matrimony 'twas headed, a lady unwedded, seeks for a husband whose virtue abounds, but his means must be such as hers, that is, as much as hers, namely a fortune of £1,000. You can't think how delighted I felt, as I plighted my troth to this lady fair in a neat note. She sent me her photograph with her dear autograph, and made an appointment. How loving she wrote. I accordingly met her, as named in her letter. She leaned on the arm of a tall, dark young man, whom she said was her brother, a captain of Strother, and thus our platonic attachment begun. I fear you'd grow tired if I were required to state how this courtship progressed from this time. Suffice it to say that we made up our minds to be married without delay. Wasn't it prime? Her brother, the captain, declared he was wrapped in delight at the prospect. His joy knew no bounds, and one day exposed to me what he disclosed to be bonds of his sister's for £1,000. Quite carelessly then he said, "On the day when ye wed, I've to make a request, quite on brotherly grounds. It is that you give your wife, for her use all her life, a settlement down of, say, £1,000. I at first felt inclined to say, flat, I declined to pay any such sum. 'Twas exceeding all bounds. But he used such persuasion that I gave up evasion, and agreed that I'd give my wife £1,000. In a week I was married, my wife home had carried. When the captain requested, I hand to my spouse the sum I'd agreed to pay down on our wedding day. I did so. I am always true to my vows. The brother smiles slightly, the bride she laughs lightly, as she picks up my cash and each sovereign sounds. And I really am vexed to say 'twas quite an ecstasy. I gave up the money, my £1,000. I suppose 'twas the hurry, the turmoil and flurry, that made me so anxious that night from my couch. Suffice it, I sought my bride, whom I missed from my side, where a moment before she was standing, I vouch. But lo, I was in the lurch, vain was my rigid search, high and low, in and out, both house and grounds. But alas, hope was banished off, too clear she vanished off, flitting away with my £1,000. My anger was kindled, I found I was swindled, and deep was the vengeance I vowed I would wreak. But I never, upon my life, once again saw my wife. She flew to America that very week. And as for her brother, he of course was no other than her lover. In faith, but they made a nice pair. So I still single tarry, because I can't marry, as I've one wife already, though goodness knows where. My wife having missile, 'twas plain I was chiseled, and yet the base swindle a moral implies, for though single I tarry, of course I can't marry. I found that experience makes a fool wise. So don't marry at random, but nil desperandum. If a man only tries, a good wife is soon found. Yet don't on your wedding day say you'll agree to pay down as a settlement £1,000. End of the Matrimonial Swindle.
My Mother by Carr. Coffee Break Collection 21. Fairy Tales, Tall Stories and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner. One bright Sunday morn, as I sat in my cell, my thoughts to the outside did roam. The sweet songs of birds, as their notes rose and fell, turned my mind to my childhood's dear home. Long years they have passed since I saw that dear spot, but its sweet memories time can ne'er smother. I can never forget that dear little cot, and the sweet loving smile of my mother. In the sickness or pain 'twas dear mother that brought her sweet self and her charms to allay it. She learned me a prayer, and she lovingly taught me to kneel at her knees and to say it. God's word she would read, and impress on my mind the love that's conveyed by that story of the Saviour who died, that millions might find eternal rest in his realms of glory. For years she's been dead, and her low grassy mound reminds me that 'neath it lies sleeping the dear friend of my youth, whose magic I find could bring smiles to my face e'en when weeping. 'Tis thus the dear birds, as they joyfully sing and chirp happy calls to each other, remind me that perhaps they were sent for to bring a message to me from my mother. But alas, as I think, upon my mind there quickly falls the thoughts of my sad degradation. The strong iron bars and the grey, sombre walls recall me to my sad situation. But no more will I sin. I'll live upright for sure, my passions and temptations I'll smother, and when God calls me home to that bright shining shore, we'll be happy together, dear mother. End of My Mother by Carr. My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson. Coffee Break Collection 21. Fairy Tales, Tall Stories and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, situated in the northeast of the island of Ireland. My Shadow. My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson. 1850 to 1894, is one of the most popular short poems extant. I have taught it to a great many very young boys, and not one has ever tried to evade learning it. Older pupils like it equally well. I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. He is very, very like me from the heels up to the head, and I see him jump about me when I jump into my bed. The funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow, not at all like proper children, which is always very slow, for he sometimes shoots up taller, like an Indian rubber ball, and he sometimes gets so little that there's none of him at all. He hasn't got a notion of how children ought to play, and can only make a fool of me in every sort of way. He stays so close beside me, he's a coward, you can see. I'd think shame to stick to nursery as that shadow sticks to me. One morning, very early, before the sun was up, I rose and found the shining dew on every buttercup. But my lazy little shadow, like an arrant sleepy-head, he had stayed at home behind me and was fast asleep in bed. Robert Louis Stevenson. End of My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson.
Nigerian Letter or 419 Fraud by the FBI. Coffee Break Collection 21, Fairy Tales, Tall Stories, and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nigerian Letter or 419 Fraud. Nigerian letter frauds combine the threat of impersonation fraud with a variation of an advance fee scheme in which a letter mailed or emailed from Nigeria offers the recipient the opportunity to share in a percentage of millions of dollars that the author, a self-proclaimed government official, is trying to transfer illegally out of Nigeria. The recipient is encouraged to send information to the author, such as blank letterhead stationery, bank name and account numbers, and other identifying information using a fax number given in the letter or return email address provided in the message. The scheme relies on convincing a willing victim who has demonstrated a propensity for larceny by responding to the invitation to send money to the author of the letter in Nigeria in several installments of increasing amounts for a variety of reasons. Payment of taxes, bribes to government officials, and legal fees are often described in great detail with the promise that all expenses will be reimbursed as soon as the funds are spirited out of Nigeria. In actuality, the millions of dollars do not exist, and the victim eventually ends up with nothing but loss. Once the victim stops sending money, the perpetrators have been known to use the personal information and checks that they received to impersonate the victim, draining bank accounts and credit card balances. While such an invitation impresses most law-abiding citizens as a laughable hoax, millions of dollars in losses are caused by these schemes annually. Some victims have been lured to Nigeria, where they have been imprisoned against their will, along with losing large sums of money. The Nigerian government is not sympathetic to victims of these schemes, since the victim actually conspires to remove funds from Nigeria in a manner that is contrary to Nigerian law. The schemes themselves violate Section 419 of the Nigerian Criminal Code. Hence the label 419 Fraud. Tips for avoiding Nigerian letter or 419 fraud. If you receive a letter or email from Nigeria asking you to send personal or banking information, do not reply in any manner. Send the letter or message to the U.S. Secret Service, your local FBI office, or the U.S. Postal Inspector Service. You can also register a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission's Complaint Assistant. If you know someone who is corresponding in one of these schemes, encourage that person to contact the FBI or the U.S. Secret Service as soon as possible. Be skeptical of individuals representing themselves as Nigerian or foreign government officials asking for your help in placing large sums of money in overseas bank accounts. Do not believe the promise of large sums of money for your cooperation. Guard your account information carefully. End of Nigerian Letter or 419 Fraud by the FBI.
Stiffner and Jim, Thirdly Bill by Henry Lawson. Coffee Break Collection 21, Fairy Tales, Tall Stories and Scams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Stiffner and Jim, Thirdly Bill. We were tramping down in Canterbury, Maryland, at the time, swagging it, me and Bill, looking for work on the new railway line. Well, one afternoon, after a long, hot tramp, we comes to Stiffner's Hotel, between Christchurch and that other place, I forget the name of it, with throats on us like sun-struck bones, and not the price of a stick of tobacco. We had to have a drink anyway, so we chanced it. We walked right into the bar, handed over our swags, put up 4 drinks, and tried to look as if we'd just drawn our cheques and didn't care a curse for any man. We looked solvent enough, as far as swagmen go. We were dirty and haggard and ragged and tired-looking, and that was all the more reason why we might have our cheques all right. This Stiffner was a hard customer. He'd been a spieler, fighting man, bush parson, temperance preacher, and a policeman, and a commercial traveller, and everything else that was damnable. He'd been a journalist and an editor. He'd been a lawyer too. He was an ugly brute to look at, and uglier to have a row with. About 6'6", wide in proportion, and stronger than Donald Dinny. He was meaner than a gold-filled Chinaman, and sharper than a sewer rat. He wouldn't give his own father a feed, nor lend him a sprat, unless some safe person backed the old man's IOU. We knew we needn't expect any mercy from Stiffner, but something had to be done, so I said to Bill, "Something's got to be done, Bill. What do you think of it?" Bill was mostly a quiet young chap from Sydney, except when he got drunk, which was seldom, and then he was a lively customer from all round. He was cracked on the subject of spielers. He held that the population of the world was divided into 2 classes. One was spielers and the other was mugs. He reckoned that he wasn't a mug. At first I thought he was a spieler, and afterwards I thought that he was a mug. He used to say that a man had to do it these times, that he was honest once and a fool and was robbed and starved in consequence by his friends and relations, but now he intended to take all that he could get. He said you either had to have or be had, that men were driven to be sharps and there was no help for it. Bill said, "We'll have to sharpen our teeth, that's all, and choose someone's lug." "How?" I asked. There was a lot of navvies at the pub, and I knew 1 or 2 by sight, so Bill says, "You know 1 or 2 of these mugs? Bite one of their ears." So I took aside a chap that I knowed and bit his ear for 10 bob, and gave it to Bill to mind, for I thought it would be safer with him than with me. "Hang on to that," I says, "and don't lose it for your natural life's sake, or Stiffner'll stiffen us." We put up about 9 bob's worth of drinks that night, me and Bill, and Stiffner didn't squeal. He was too sharp. He shouted once or twice. By and by I left Bill and turned in, and in the morning, when I woke up, there was Bill sitting alongside of me and looking about as lively as the fighting kangaroo in London in fog time. He had a black eye and 18 pence. He'd been taking down some of the mugs. "Well, what's to be done now?" I asked. "Stiffner can smash us both with one hand, and if we don't pay up he'll pound our swags and cripple us. He's just the man to do it. He loves a fight even more than he hates being had." "There's only one thing to be done, Jim," says Bill, in a tired, disinterested tone that made me mad. "Well, what's that?" I said. "Smoke." "Smoke be damned," I snarled, losing my temper. "You know dashed well that our swags are in the bar, and we can't smoke without them." "Well then," says Bill, "I'll toss you to see who's to face the landlord." "Well, I'll be blessed," I says. "I'll see you further first. You've got a front. You mugged that stuff away, and you'll have to get us out of this mess." It made him wild to be called a mug, and we swore and growled at each other for a while, but we daren't speak loud enough to have a fight, so at last I agreed to toss up for it, and I lost. Bill started to give me some of his points, but I shut him up quick. "You've had your turn and made a mess of it," I said. "For God's sake, give me a show. Now I'll go into the bar and ask for the swags, and carry them out to the verandah, and then go back to settle up. You keep him talking all the time. You dump the swags together and smoke like Sheol. That's all you've got to do." I went into the bar, got the swags from the missus, carried them out onto the verandah, and then went back. Stiffner came in. "Good morning." "Good morning, sir," says Stiffner. "It'll be a nice day, I think." "Yeah, I think so. I suppose you're going on?" "Yes, we'll have to make a move today." Then I hooked carelessly onto the counter with one elbow and looked dreary-like out across the clearing, and presently I gave a sort of sigh and said, "Oh, well, I think I'll have a beer." "Right you are. Where's your mate?" "Oh, he's round at the back. He'll be round directly, but he isn't drinking this morning." Stiffner laughed that nasty empty laugh of his. He thought Bill was whipping the cat. "What's yours, boss?" I said. "Thank ye. Here's luck." "Here's luck." The country was pretty open round there. The nearest timber was better than a mile away, and I wanted to give Bill a good start across the flat before the go-as-you-can commenced. So I talked for a while, and while we were talking I thought I might as well go the whole hog. I might as well die for a pound as a penny if I had to die, and if I hadn't I'd have the pound to the good anyway, so to speak. Anyhow, the risk would be about the same or less, for I might have the spirit to run harder the more I had to run for, the more spirits I had to run for, in fact, as it turned out. So I says, "I think I'll take one of them there flasks of whisky to last us on the road." "Right you are," says Stiffner. "What'll you have, a small one or a big one?" "Oh, a big one, I think, if I can get it into my pocket." "It'll be a tight squeeze," he said, and laughed. "I'll try," I said. "Bet you 2 drinks I'll get it in." "Done," he says. "The top inside coat pocket, and no tearing." It was a big bottle, and all my pockets were small, but I got it into the pocket he'd bet it against. It was a tight squeeze, but I got it in. Then we both laughed, but his laugh was nastier than usual, because it was meant to be pleasant, and he'd lost 2 drinks. And my laugh wasn't easy. I was anxious as to which of us would laugh next. Just then I noticed something, and an idea struck me. About the most up-to-date idea that ever struck me in my life. I noticed that Stiffner was limping on his right foot this morning, so I said to him, "What's up with your foot?" putting my hand in my pocket. "Oh, it's a crimson nail in me boot," he said. "I thought I got the blanky thing out this morning, but I didn't." There just happened to be an old bag of shoemaker's tools in the bar, belonging to an old cobbler who was lying dead drunk on the verandah. So I said, taking my hand out of my pocket again, "Lend us the boot and I'll fix it in a minute. That's my old trade." "Oh, so you're a shoemaker," he said. "I'd never have thought it." He laughs one of his useless laughs that wasn't wanted and slips off the boot. He hadn't laced it up, and hands it across the bar to me. It was an ugly brute, a great thick iron-bound boiler-plated navvy's boot. It made me feel sore when I looked at it. I got the bag and pretended to fix the nail, but I didn't. "There's a couple of nails gone from the sole," I said. "I'll put 'em in if I can find any hobnails, and it'll save the sole." And I rooted in the bag and found a good long nail and shoved it right through the sole on the sly. He'd been a bit of a sprinter in his time, and I thought it might be better for me in the near future if the spikes of his running shoes were inside. "There, you'll find that better, I fancy," I said, standing the boot on the bar counter, but keeping my hand on it in an absent-minded kind of way. Presently I yawned and stretched myself, and said in a careless way, "Ah, well, how's the slate?" He scratched the back of his head and pretended to think. "Oh, well, we'll call it 30, Bob." Perhaps he thought I'd slapped down £2. "Well," I says, "and what will you do supposing we don't pay you?" He looked blank for a moment. Then he fired up and gasped and choked once or twice, and then he cooled down suddenly and laughed his nastiest laugh. He was one of those men who always laugh when they're wild, and said in a nasty quiet tone, "You thunderin' jumped-up crawlers, if you don't something, well part up I'll take your swags, and something, well kick your gory pants so you won't be able to sit down for a month, or stand up either." "Well, the sooner you begin the better," I said, and I chucked the boot into a corner and bolted. He jumped the bar counter, got his boot, and came after me. He paused to slip the boot on, but he only made one step and then gave a howl and slung the boot off and rushed back. When I looked round again, he'd got a slipper on and was coming, and gaining on me too. I shifted scenery pretty quick the next 5 minutes, but I was soon pumped. My heart began to beat against the ceiling of my head, and my lungs all choked up in my throat. When I guessed he was getting within kicking distance, I glanced round so's to dodge the kick. He let out, but I shied just in time. He missed fire, and the slipper went about 20 feet up in the air and fell in a waterhole. He was done then, for the ground was stubbly and stony. I seen Bill on ahead, pegging out for the horizon, and I took after him and reached for the timber for all I was worth, for I'd seen Stiffner's missus comin' with a shovel, to bury the remains, I suppose, and those two were a good match. Stiffner and his missus, I mean. Bill looked round once and melted into the bush pretty soon after that. When I caught up he was about done, but I grabbed my swag and we pushed on, for I'd told Bill that I'd seen Stiffner making for the stables when I last looked round, and Bill thought that we'd better get lost in the bush as soon as ever we could, and stay lost too, for Stiffner was a man that couldn't stand being had. The first thing that Bill said when we got safe into camp was, "I told you we'd pull through all right. You need never be frightened when you're travelling with me. Just take my advice and leave things to me, and we'll hang out all right now." But I shut him up. He made me mad. "Why, you... what the shell did you do?" "Do?" he says. "I got away with the swags, didn't I? Where'd they be now if it wasn't for me?" Then I sat on him pretty hard for his pretensions, and paid him out for all the patronage he'd worked off on me, and called him a mug straight, and walked round him, so to speak, and blowed, and told him never to pretend to me again that he was a battler. Then, when I thought I'd licked him into form, I cooled down and soaped him up a bit, but I never thought that he had 3 climaxes and a crisis in store for me. He took it all pretty well. He let me have my fling and gave me time to get breath. Then he leaned languidly over on his right side, shoved his left hand down into his left trouser pocket and brought up a bootlace, a box of matches, and 9 and 6. As soon as I got the focus of it, I gasped. Where the deuce did you get that?" "I had it all along," he said, "but I seen at the pub that you had the show to chew a lug, so I thought we'd save it. 9 and sixpences ain't picked up every day." Then he leaned over on his left, went down into the other pocket, and came up with a piece of tobacco and half a sovereign. My eyes bulged out. "Where the blazes did you get that from?" I yelled. "That," he said, "was the half-quid you gave me last night. Half-quids ain't to be thrown away these times, and besides, I had a down on Stiffner, and meant to pay him out, and I reckon that if we wasn't sharp enough to take him down, we hadn't any business to be supposed to be alive. Anyway, I guessed we'd do it, and so we did, and got a bottle of whisky into the bargain." Then he leaned back, tied like against the log, and dredged his upper left-hand waistcoat pocket and brought up a sovereign wrapped in a pound note. Then he waited for me to speak, but I couldn't. I got my mouth open, but couldn't get it shut again. "I got that out of the mugs last night, but I thought that we'd want it, and might as well keep it. Quids ain't so easily picked up nowadays, and besides, we need stuff more than Stiffner does, and so—" "And did he know you had the stuff?" I gasped. "Oh, yeah, that's the fun of it. That's what made him so excited. He was in the parlour all the time I was playing. But we might as well have a drink." We did. I wanted it. Bill turned in by and by and looked like a sleeping innocent in the moonlight. I sat up late and smoked and thought hard and watched Bill and turned in and thought till near daylight, and then went to sleep and had a nightmare about it. I dreamed I chased Stiffner 40 miles to buy his pub, and that Bill turned out to be his nephew. Bill divvied up all right and gave me half a crown over, but I didn't travel with him long after that. He was a decent young fellow as far as chaps go, and a good mate as far as mates go, but he was too far ahead for a peaceful, easy-going chap like me. It would have worn me out in a year to keep up to him. End of Stiffner and Jim, Thirdly Bill. Recording by Son of the Exiles.